The mystery begins now. It was on a sullen March evening, the kind which presses dampness into the bones and muffles all sound in its wake, that I found myself once again in the old sitting room at Baker Street. The rain slithered down the window panes in slow, deliberate streaks, and Holmes, with his back to the fire, held his violin beneath his chin like a confessor to some private sorrow. He played, not his usual spirited Bach or whimsical Paganini, but a tune I did not know, haunting and strangely beautiful, a lament that seemed not merely played, but mourned. There was no conversation between us. Holmes had spent much of the day in silence, save for a brief comment on the ash consistency of a half-burnt cigar stub. I watched him for some time, sensing in the slow cadence of his bow an unspoken mood, and it was in that hush between two drawn notes that the doorbell rang, shrill and sudden, disrupting the hush like a pebble dropped into still water. Mrs. Hudson admitted a figure cloaked against the storm, tall, angular, and curiously theatrical. What struck me first was the half-mask of dark velvet he wore, obscuring one side of his face like a man fresh from the stage. Water dripped from the hem of his coat, but he stood unmoving in the doorway, as though awaiting the verdict of a silent judge. "My name," he said quietly, "is of no consequence." "Then your business must be," Holmes replied, setting down his instrument without rising. "Pray step in before the fog follows you up the stairs." As the man crossed the threshold into our sitting room, Holmes' eyes sharpened like a hound scenting game. His gaze moved from the flecks of pale mud on the client's soles to the faint red abrasion at the base of his neck, the mark of a violin strap. A thickened callus on the left fingertip confirmed the habit of pressing strings, while a peculiar stain on the cuff suggested recent contact with a musician's rosin. "You've come far," Holmes murmured, "and rather faster than your coat was meant to bear. The train from Dover, I believe. Third class, and in haste." The man stiffened slightly, and though his voice was controlled, I detected a tremor beneath its surface. "I must beg your confidence, Mr. Holmes. I cannot, must not, be known in this matter." He kept a gloved hand clenched tightly about the base of a worn leather case he carried. When Holmes gestured for him to sit, he did so with the air of a man who feared he might never rise again. Holmes nodded. "Anonymity is the least of what we offer here, though I suspect you have already sacrificed truth upon its altar." A shadow passed over the mask. The man said nothing. The masked figure leaned forward, lowering his voice to a breath. "If I do not act within the week, I fear a woman will die, and I may be the cause." Holmes' fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A curious construction," he said softly. "You do not say she will be murdered, only that she will die. Nor that you will kill her, but that you may cause her death." "I cannot say more." "Not yet," the man said, glancing toward the curtained window. "Then say only this," Holmes replied. "Why have you come now, and not before?" The man exhaled. "Because now, she is beginning to play again." It was in that moment, that peculiar turn of phrase so pregnant with hidden meaning, that I saw the familiar glint alight in Holmes' eyes. The languor of the evening was gone. A case had arrived, cloaked in mystery, dressed in music, and trailed by the scent of something altogether more sinister. He sat with the discomfort of one unused to confession. The fire hissed quietly behind Holmes, casting long shadows upon the walls. But the man in the mask seemed oblivious to both warmth and light. When Holmes prompted him for his name, he shifted, as though the very syllables weighed against him. "I am known in some circles as Eric Valdemar," he said slowly, "though it is not the name under which I was born. Nor, I suppose, will it be the one by which history remembers me, if memory is granted me at all." Holmes inclined his head, steepling his fingers. "Then let us proceed with Valdemar, until the moment compels another." His tone was light, but I detected the subtle tightening in his posture, a readiness, like that of a violinist poised just before the bow strikes the first note. The man nodded. So be it. I am a violinist. Or rather, I was. I have received letters, Valdemar continued, his voice low and clipped, typed, unsigned, and unmistakable. The sender knows too much. He refers to performances that no critic covered, rehearsals that no journal recorded. He knows what happened in Jura. Holmes said nothing, and I, though the name meant nothing to me, could see the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, the indication of some association forming behind his cool grey gaze. Valdemar pressed on. The man claims to be Istvan Reti. At this, Holmes raised an eyebrow. Reti? I had understood him to be rather deceased. As did I, Valdemar replied bitterly. He was presumed drowned in the Danube 7 years ago. Now he writes to me as if from a crypt, threatening to drag me down in his place. He claims to have proof of my involvement in a tragic incident I have spent a lifetime erasing, and worse still, he demands I commit an act I cannot bear. And what is that? Holmes asked softly. To destroy a performance, and perhaps a life. I was playing for the household of Count Banfi in Pest. Valdemar began, his voice faltering for the first time. It was meant to be a private recital, Reti, myself, and a small quartet performing for the Count and his daughter. A political evening, perhaps, though the music was our only duty. What occurred? I asked. Valdemar hesitated, then continued. There was a quarrel between Reti and the Count. Words were exchanged, sharp and sudden, and then, during the final piece, the chandelier fell. Directly above Reti? Holmes inquired. Valdemar's eyes were haunted behind the mask. Yes, it was dismissed as structural decay. The affair was smoothed over. No police, only silence. The Count arranged for all involved to leave Hungary shortly after. Reti was presumed dead. And you presumed yourself safe, Holmes murmured. Valdemar's lips tightened. Until now Reti writes of vengeance, of justice. He demands I become the saboteur of a young woman's triumph, or he will expose the truth, however he might spin it. Holmes leaned back. Truth, after all, is only dangerous when others believe it. She is called Amelia Verres, said Valdemar, barely 20, a prodigy of unusual brilliance, refined, intuitive, untouched by the viciousness of the professional world. I taught her, briefly, under another name. Reti now demands I mar her debut. A single ruined note, a public humiliation, something to fracture her ascent. And if you refuse? I asked. He says he will tell the world what I did in Pest, that I was complicit, that I helped conceal a death. Holmes drummed his fingers once upon his knee. So your options are confession or sabotage. It is, I must admit, a delightfully cruel composition. Valdemar did not answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced one of the letters, yellowed, unaddressed, and lined with precisely cut Hungarian syllables. Holmes took it without a word and held it up to the firelight, scanning the text as a conductor might a familiar score. The rosin on your sleeve, Holmes remarked suddenly, is fresh. Too fresh for a man who claims to have laid down his instrument. Valdemar blinked. Old habit, he said, though not convincingly. Indeed. And your right hand trembles, not from age, nor fear, but from overuse and strain. You are still playing, perhaps in secrecy, perhaps for yourself. Valdemar offered no reply. Only a flicker of something like shame. Then there is the matter of your tobacco, Holmes continued, which is unmistakably of Szeged blend, an Eastern preparation scarcely found outside the border provinces of Hungary. It clings to your collar like a signature. You know the scent? I know what clings to a man who writes letters with a vengeance. Valdemar's shoulders sagged slightly, and Holmes softened, only slightly. You've come to preserve a career, or a reputation, but what you may truly wish to protect is her. A long silence followed. Finally, the man spoke. If anything happens to Amelia, it will not be Preti who breaks me. Holmes folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the violin case. Then we must ensure no one plays the final note before it's time. You understand, Mr. Valdemar, Holmes said, rising at last, that this case touches on 3 instruments, one in your hands, one in your enemy's, and one that may yet be broken before her first crescendo. Valdemar stood as well, but said nothing. He clutched his hat as a man might cling to a final measure of dignity. I will investigate, Holmes said, but I offer no promise of protection, only truth. And sometimes the truth plays in a key we do not choose. Valdemar bowed slightly, the gesture more theatrical than sincere. That is all I ask. Once he had gone, Holmes turned to me. There is more to this than ruined concerts and phantom letters, Watson. Indeed, I asked. He nodded. The music is not what worries me. It is the silence Preti intends to follow it. We stood for some time after the masked violinist had gone, the fog once again curling against the windows, as if reluctant to release him to the streets below. I cannot decide, I said, whether the man is truly guilty or simply haunted. Holmes was at the mantel now, fingering the strings of his own instrument with delicate precision. In matters of music and memory, Watson, guilt and haunting often walk in unison. He drew the bow once across the strings, a low note rising like smoke in the quiet. It is a case of rivalries, concealed truths, and one young woman who may yet be the unwilling soloist in someone else's requiem. And where shall we begin? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. With the girl who does not yet know she is in danger, and the man who may have already placed her upon the stage. It was 2 days later that Holmes and I found ourselves seated in the modest rehearsal chamber of the Marylebone Conservatory, a narrow brick structure whose ivy-clad windows rattled faintly in the March wind. Amelia Verres stood at the center of the room, framed by a circle of empty music stands and the faint scent of varnish. She was slender, composed, and seemed to glow with that peculiar intensity which only the very gifted possess. Yet her eyes, as Holmes immediately remarked to me in a whisper, watched the door more than the bow. She began to play a caprice by Berlioz, and the sound was exquisite, rich, precise, and heartbreakingly pure. But Holmes sat forward slightly, his brows drawing together as if something invisible had slipped between the notes. I heard nothing amiss, but I've long since ceased to trust my ear where Holmes' instincts were concerned. When she concluded, there was polite applause from a small cluster of staff, but Holmes merely tapped his fingers on the bench beside him. She plays, he murmured, as one who expects to be interrupted, and dreads who may be standing behind her when it happens. As Amelia tuned her violin for the second piece, Holmes leaned toward me. There, did you catch it? Catch what? Her rhythm. In the third variation, there's a hesitation after every ascent. Not in the music, mind you, but in her hands. It's not nervousness, Watson. It's rehearsal layered over avoidance. You think she is hiding something in her technique? Not hiding, he said. Signaling. That piece is meant to sing, but she muffles it, as though afraid of where it might lead her. She is playing under a shadow, and it weighs more than mere stage fright. I regarded her again, this time noticing the flicker of her eyes toward the gallery above the piano. She smiled at the accompanist, but there was tension in the corners of her mouth that did not lift when the music did. Holmes tapped his cane once against the floor. Someone is watching her, he said quietly, and she knows it. I turned at once in the direction Holmes had indicated, and caught sight of a bearded man in a brown overcoat, seated alone in the upper gallery. His presence seemed unremarkable at first glance. A patron, perhaps, or an instructor, but Holmes had already risen and was quietly making his way up the narrow stairs. I followed several paces behind, noting the peculiar gait of the figure above us, which bore the uneven rhythm of a man with a stiffened leg. or recent injury, but as we reached the landing, the figure rose abruptly and slipped behind the curtain near the stairwell. By the time we passed through, he was gone, not vanished like a magician, but with the precise speed of one who had measured every inch of his escape beforehand. He limps, Holmes muttered, scanning the stairwell, but he is no invalid. Do you believe that was Retty? I believe, Holmes said, that we have just seen someone who does not wish the girl to succeed, and who knows precisely when and where to vanish. He stooped and touched the balustrade. Dust disturbed, no fingerprints. Someone trained, or careful, perhaps both. While Holmes examined the gallery further, I took the opportunity to converse with one of the conservatory's assistants, a thin, red-haired girl named Clara, who seemed genuinely fond of Miss Verez. She's brilliant, Clara told me, but always on edge these days. I've seen her tear up letters without reading them. What sort of letters? I asked. She never says, but they come in brown envelopes, always the same handwriting. She hides them in the third drawer, under her music scores. And has she told anyone? Only her mentor, Clara whispered. Mr. Sandor, I believe, a Hungarian gentleman, very kind, but odd. He hasn't been around for a few weeks. I nodded gravely, concealing my own surprise. So Valdemar, or rather Sandor, had placed himself near her all this time. Holmes would not be surprised. He had, I suspected, already deduced it. Still, it raised a chilling question. Who, then, had stepped in to watch her now? When Holmes rejoined me in the corridor, I relayed Clara's comments about Emilia's mentor, a Hungarian gentleman known to the conservatory as Mr. Sandor. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. So, our Mr. Valdemar has not merely remained near the girl, he has inserted himself as her guardian angel, which strikes me as oddly protective for a man claiming to be the threat, I said. Indeed, Holmes replied. Guilt often masquerades as guidance, Watson. He fears what Retty will do and hopes to intercept it, but proximity breeds risk. Then why not simply warn her? Because her trust, Holmes said coolly, is the only currency he still possesses. Once he spends it, he is bankrupt, morally, professionally, and, I suspect, emotionally. We turned to leave the building, but Holmes paused at the threshold. He taught her to play, Watson. Now he fears the next performance may be her final one. Later that evening, Holmes directed me to the archives at the Hungarian Club near Pall Mall, a narrow reading room lined with dusty journals and society registers. He requested every volume concerning court music and noble houses between 1883 and 1818, a range I found both oddly specific and eerily well considered. He pored over them with tireless focus, flipping past scores of pages until he paused over a yellowed article from a Het, a Budapest periodical. I leaned in and saw the headline, Scandal at the House of Banffy, Music, Madness, and Mourning. Read the final paragraph, Holmes said, tapping the text. It recounted the mysterious death of a music tutor named Retty during a private recital, and the subsequent withdrawal of Count Istvan Banffy from political life. His daughter, said to be a gifted violinist, had disappeared from the public eye soon after. Holmes's finger traced the name of the daughter, Emilia Banffy. Changed now to Verez, Holmes murmured. She is not merely Sandor's pupil. She is the daughter of the house Retty once served. And Sandor? I asked. Holmes closed the book gently. He served there as well, though not as tutor, as accomplice, or rival, or both. Back at the conservatory the following day, Holmes asked to examine Emilia's rehearsal room while she was out, with a courteous nod from the headmistress, who seemed to view Holmes as some minor musical patron. We were granted access. On her desk lay a fine violin case, embossed in dark leather with the initials EBV, barely visible beneath a newer monogram. Holmes opened the lid carefully and peered inside. Nestled beneath the velvet lining, near the hinge, he retrieved a tiny fragment, a broken hair clasp, the kind worn by young girls. He turned it over and sniffed. Sandalwood oil, worn regularly, likely for years. But she is older now, I remarked. She keeps it hidden. It is a relic, not an accessory. He then drew out a folded envelope wedged in the inner pocket. Its corner bore a dark purple smear. Not ink, he said, but papatinta, a pigment found only in Hungarian correspondence ink. It was imported, but rarely. Whoever handled this paper was familiar with its source, or wanted to appear so. So either Retty left it, or someone meant us to think he did. That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes sat cross-legged before the fire, his violin resting silent across his knees. He had not played a note since returning from the conservatory, though I sensed music was churning silently within him, measured, scrutinized and dissected as only he could do. You recall her hesitation during the burial? He asked. Of course. You said she muffled the accents. Not muffled, he corrected. Encoded. There was a pattern in her restraint. Each held note was exactly 2 beats longer than required, and always following the same sequence. Do you suggest she is playing a cipher? Holmes gave a faint smile. Not consciously, but those who carry secrets often express them in the only language they trust. For Amelia, that language is music, and she is, I believe, unconsciously telling us she is afraid, not of failure, but of betrayal. She suspects someone close to her. She suspects she is being watched, Holmes said. She has changed instruments 3 times in 2 weeks, but always returns to the original, the one gifted to her by Sandor. I frowned. You think he tampered with it? I think, Holmes replied coldly, that in a world of masks and mourning, even violins may be made to lie. It was rare for Holmes to exclude me from an inquiry outright. Yet that is precisely what he did on the 3rd morning after our visit to the conservatory. He rose early, dressed with meticulous care, and departed without his usual commentary. You'll find the Times dull without me, he said, reaching for his gloves. But I must see to a particular thread alone. It may unravel, or it may reveal the pattern. We shall know by dusk. Do you anticipate danger? I asked, perhaps a shade too eagerly. He offered the faintest smile. Only the danger of false assumptions. By late afternoon, he returned, his coat flecked with dust, his collar slightly frayed, but his eyes alight with that unmistakable gleam that told me he had found the thing he was seeking, or something entirely unexpected. He removed a narrow object wrapped in cloth and placed it on the mantel. You'll want to know where I've been, he said. Let's begin with a boarding house in Kensington, and a piano tuner who doesn't play by ear alone. The man is known there as Mr. Joseph, Holmes began, settling into his chair. A soft-spoken gentleman, blind from an alleged boiler accident, who tunes the instruments for several private academies. But when I arrived, he was at work upon an upright Broadwood, and I noticed 3 things immediately. I leaned forward, which were: 1. His left eye is milky, but intact. It does not track, but it flutters slightly when startled. 2. The way he handled the hammers. He used his right index finger to check spacing, not his ears. And 3. A scuff on the inside of his wrist, where a violinist braces the instrument. You believe this Mr. Joseph is Retty? Without question. The voice is identical to a recording preserved by the Royal Society. I presented myself as a patron seeking tuning for a gift. When I dropped Amelia's name, he paled. Not theatrically, but as if the ghost of his past had walked into the room. Did he confess? Not in words, but I mentioned Pest, the house of Bamfy and the chandelier. His hand trembled. He asked me to leave. I did. And you're certain it was Retty? Holmes nodded. As certain as I am that he fears not exposure, but interruption. I accompanied Holmes the following evening, as he had arranged a second meeting with Retty, under the guise of returning for a tuning appointment. But as we approached the boarding house, Holmes drew up short. He's bolted, he murmured. See the curtains? Moved too recently. We gave chase through the narrow alleys of Kensington, Holmes ahead, swift and tireless as a bloodhound on the scent. I followed with less grace, but tireless as a bloodhound on the scent. I followed with less grace, but equal determination. At a bend near the mews, Holmes turned sharply and caught sight of a shadow ducking between two ash bins. We cornered him briefly, a gaunt figure with a thick beard and pale eyes that flashed with defiance. But before we could close the gap, he flung a small canister to the ground, releasing a plume of foul smoke, and vanished through a tradesman's passage. Holmes, coughing, retrieved something from the gutter, a length of violin string, slick with a strange dark residue. He dropped this in haste, he said, or left it as a warning. I examined it. What is it? Holmes pocketed the string. A question, he replied. And, I suspect, part of the answer. By the time we reached Baker Street again, Holmes had already summoned the analytical tools he kept with the reverence other men reserve for family heirlooms. He spread the violin string upon a porcelain dish and applied heat beneath it. A thin smoke rose, pungent and metallic. I thought so, he muttered. I waited, as always, for the lecture. This is not rosin, he said. It is a synthetic compound, a resin mixed with ferrous oxide and a trace of camphor, used only in the maintenance of steel piano wire, but applied to gut strings. It would weaken them, I ventured. It would silence them, he replied. Over time, it causes fraying at the core. With just the right tension, say, mid-performance, the string snaps. I stared at the instrument. Then the girl's violin may already be tainted, or it was meant to be switched. Either way, someone wanted her performance to end in failure, or in blood. He folded the string and placed it in an envelope. I shall need to test Amelia's instrument personally, he said, and when I do, I believe we shall find more than poor craftsmanship. We may find intent. The following morning, as I returned from an errand, I found Holmes at the breakfast table, reading a slim envelope with all the gravity of a physician examining a final diagnosis. Your hunch about Amelia's parentage, I began. Have you confirmed it? He nodded without looking up. Confirmed, documented, and, I suspect, already known by both our principal players. Emilia Verres is the adopted name of Count Istvan Bamfi's daughter, Emilia Bamfi, the girl who vanished after the chandelier incident in Pest. But that would make her the heir of a disgraced house, I said, and Retty's former pupil, and Sandor's pupil as well, in more ways than one, Holmes replied. He was her father's court musician, a minor noble by blood but with grand ambition. When Retty died, or was presumed to, Sandor fled Hungary and reinvented himself. But guilt, Watson, has a curious shelf life. Does Amelia know? That, said Holmes, is the question we must answer next. If she suspects her heritage, she has said nothing, but her music says much. The name change was legal, arranged through her father's solicitor in Vienna, likely to protect her, but now the past has crept back in, and threatens to finish what it once began. The Count Bamfi affair, Holmes continued, spreading open a folded clipping from a Budapest paper, was not merely political, but personal. Retty had accused the Count of altering scores, of suppressing younger talent, namely his daughters. There was jealousy, Watson, but also genuine artistry at stake. Sandor, the third in the triangle, was the quietest of the three, until the chandelier fell. You believe Sandor was complicit? Possibly, or perhaps merely present when fate intervened, but he survived, prospered, and eventually found Amelia again, conveniently when she reached an age fit for the stage. He gave her a new name, issued new music, and a chance at erasing what came before. Except Retty survived, I murmured, and now seeks his revenge, not on Sandor directly, but through the girl they both shaped. If she falters, the scandal reopens. If she succeeds, Sandor is redeemed. And if she dies on stage, Holmes' eyes darkened, then both men are erased, in different ways. Reti removes the living symbol of his shame. Sandor loses his final composition. Amelia, unwitting perhaps, is being wielded like a bow across the strings of justice and vengeance. And the concert, I asked. It is not a performance, Holmes said. It is a reckoning, finely tuned, and moments from beginning. That evening, Holmes asked me to draft a letter to Inspector Lestrade, requesting a discreet presence at the concert hall. I confess I wrote it with growing unease. You intend to have the yard present? I asked. Do you suspect an overt attack? I suspect nothing, Holmes replied, which is precisely why I prepare for everything. He laid out several components of his plan, a decoy violin case, a pair of tinted spectacles, and what appeared to be a harmless coil of string. And what is all this? I inquired. Distractions, Watson. Theatre is about illusion, not truth. While they watch one hand, I shall act with the other. You intend to trap both Reti and Sandor? Holmes smiled faintly. No, I intend to let them trap each other. I merely ensure the walls of the box are firm. And Amelia? She must believe the concert proceeds as planned. No fear, no doubt. Her instinct must remain intact. But if something goes wrong, then I will be precisely where I need to be. Not on the stage, but in the margins. The silence between the notes, Watson, is where meaning lives. And the risk? Holmes looked up. Is that we are wrong, and music becomes mourning. We sat long into the night, Holmes quietly restringing a violin identical to Amelia's, while I watched the shadows grow deeper across the floor. You've often said, I murmured, that it is the detail most easily overlooked which contains the truth. Holmes glanced up. Yes, most men watch the hands. Fewer listen to the rests. I frowned. You believe the danger lies not in the music itself, but in the pauses. In the moments when nothing is said, he corrected. When emotion falters and instinct speaks. That is where a saboteur works best, in silence. You shall see, Watson. The night of the concert, we will all be listening for the notes. But He tightened the final peg, snapped the case shut, and stood. We'll be watching for the silence. There was something in his voice, not fear, but certainty layered with a quiet, almost funereal resolve. I said nothing more that evening. The violin case remained by the door, and Holmes did not sleep. The concert hall on Wigmore Street was already half filled when Holmes, Lestrade, and I arrived by separate entrances under his precise instructions. It was one of those modest venues that boasted more history than grandeur. Red velvet seats, narrow galleries, and acoustics that were both intimate and unforgiving. Holmes had always claimed that such rooms were designed for confessions, not applause. We had taken our positions as planned, Lestrade stationed discreetly behind the curtains to the left of the stage, Holmes blending in amongst the press in the gallery above, and I seated in the stage, Holmes blending in amongst the press in the gallery above, and I seated in the second row with a view of both Amelia and the orchestra pit. The atmosphere crackled with polite anticipation. Amelia was to perform a solo arrangement of Sarasate's De Weisen, a choice Holmes found interesting. She is sending a message, he had said to me the night before. To whom, and from what, remains to be heard. As the house lights dimmed, the silence that fell was near sacred. I scanned the audience and caught sight of a bearded man in the shadows of the upper box, a face familiar from the gallery at the conservatory. Holmes had seen him too. I could feel it in the shift of the air, as if the curtain itself were holding its breath. I learned afterward that Holmes had found his way backstage, moments before Amelia's entrance. Slipping into the wing during a stagehand's distraction, she had been tuning her violin, the very one gifted to her by Sandor, when he approached. I beg your pardon, he had said softly, but you must trust me and use the instrument to your left, the one resting on the blue velvet. Amelia, by all accounts, looked startled. That one isn't mine. No, Holmes replied. But yours was meant to betray you. He did not wait for an answer. He simply nodded once and withdrew before anyone could notice. It was a perilous move, one that relied entirely upon Amelia's instincts, and the hope that her trust in the man who had once mentored her had now tilted ever so slightly toward doubt. She took the substitute. From my seat, I saw her step into the light, bow in hand, face composed. The orchestra gave its soft cue, and her bow met the strings. Behind me, a breath caught in the shadows. The music began with elegance, rising like smoke from Amelia's strings. Her technique was precise, perhaps even more refined than in rehearsal, but Holmes, ever the conductor of consequence, was not watching her hands. He was watching the man in the upper box, who leaned forward with unnatural stillness. Midway through the second variation, just as the tempo climbed and the E string would bear the most tension, there came a sharp, dry snap, not from Amelia's violin, but from the one Holmes had quietly arranged to be tuned identically and laid beneath the gallery. The effect was devastating. The audience gasped. Amelia halted, not in panic, but in perfect professional control. She lowered her bow, looked calmly toward the conductor, and gave the subtlest of nods. Then, as if it had been scripted all along, she stepped back and took up her own instrument. This time, the one Holmes had tested and approved. From the gallery, a figure rose hastily and began making his way toward the staircase. I turned toward the sound of the broken string again, and saw that it had been rigged not on stage, but beneath it. Holmes had not merely anticipated sabotage. He had staged it. As Amelia resumed her performance with unshaken poise, a disturbance broke at the rear of the auditorium. The bearded man, Ratey, we knew now without doubt, shoved past a pair of ushers and vaulted the pit rail with a suddenness that betrayed months of pent-up violence. In his hand was a conductor's baton, a sleek, unremarkable rod at first glance, but gripped with too much purpose for mere flourish. The orchestra stuttered to a halt. Amelia froze, bow mid-air. Holmes was already moving. From his place in the gallery, he dropped down the side stairs with the speed of a panther. Lestrade appeared simultaneously at the opposite wing. "Sir," one of the ushers cried. "You can't." But Retty was past them, heading straight for Amelia. Holmes intercepted him just as he reached the edge of the stage. There was no scuffle, no dramatic leap, only a hand. Holmes's hand, reaching calmly into the man's lapel, seizing his wrist, and wrenching the batons free. "It's not your music to conduct," Holmes said coolly. Retty's eyes flared, with rage, or sorrow, or something deeper than either. The baton clattered to the floor. Lestrade stepped in. The applause had not yet resumed, because no one dared breathe. Later, in the backstage hallway lined with dusty props and scores of forgotten arrangements, Holmes handed the baton to Lestrade with an air of precise disgust. "Do not touch the tip," he instructed. "Contains a hollow channel, quite narrow, filled with a gelatinous toxin, plant-based, derived, I believe, from Aconitum napellus." Lestrade frowned. "Monkshood?" "Correct," Holmes said. "Odorless, quick to absorb through skin or bloodstream, often fatal." Ratey had intended to pierce Amelia with the needle. A brush of the hand, perhaps disguised as a correction or gesture. A silent death, mid-performance, followed by confusion, grief, and a legend. Lestrade held the object at arm's length. "He's lucky we caught him." Holmes tilted his head. "No, Inspector. He's unlucky that I listened, not to the music, but to the fear beneath it. I watched as Retty, now restrained, refused to meet Amelia's gaze. She, to her credit, stood calm but pale. Her fingers trembled, but not from performance nerves. "Why her?" I asked Holmes softly. "Why would he want to kill the very symbol of his legacy?" Holmes gave no answer at first. Then quietly he said, "Because in her, He saw what he might have been, had he chosen beauty over bitterness. Reti, once a ghost in every sense, now stood in flesh and breathless fury beneath the concert hall's dull gaslight. Lestrade's men had secured his arms with practiced firmness, but it was Holmes who stepped closer, and, with a swift hand, removed the small patch of theatrical latex from beneath the man's jaw, revealing a scar I recalled from the grainy photograph in the conservatory's archives. "Istvan Reti," Holmes declared, and for once even Lestrade offered no protest. "Presumed dead in 1891 during the train fire in Zekesverhervar. Yet here he is, resurrected by rage and the promise of a final cadenza." Reti said nothing. His breathing was labored, but not from exertion. It was humiliation, unmasked not merely in face, but in intent. Amelia, silent still, gazed at him with no recognition. Whether it was shock or choice, I could not be certain. "You were never her protector," Holmes murmured. "Only her prison." And with that, he turned from Reti, as one might from a false note in a perfect symphony. Regrettable, but not worth dwelling upon. We were barely 2 corridors removed from the concert hall, when Holmes, without slowing his stride, said, "You recall the woman in the veil, the one who claimed to be Amelia's sponsor?" "Of course," I said. "She arranged the recital, covered the expenses, insisted we look after the girl's safety." "What of her?" "She wished to eliminate both the protégé and the phantom mentor in one elegant performance," Holmes said coolly. "A poisoned baton for Reti's hand, a sabotaged violin for Amelia's. Had either of them succeeded, the other would have borne the blame, and in the ensuing scandal, the noble house of Verres would fade from memory altogether." I stopped dead in my tracks. "But surely she intended to save Amelia?" Holmes gave me a brief, cold glance. "No, Watson. She intended to erase her. But why? Because Amelia is inconvenient, a living remainder of disgrace. Her existence threatens a claim, a name, an inheritance. If she played and perished as a martyr, she'd be mourned briefly, but never investigated. And Reti was the match to light the blaze. The client merely waited to step over the ashes." I could only shake my head, but she seemed so protective. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "The most dangerous guardians, my dear Watson, are those who guard not people, but secrets." Even as Reti was led away in shackles, Holmes did not rest. I followed him back toward the empty concert hall, where the orchestra had long since disbanded, and only the creak of boards remained. Without a word, he stepped lightly onto the stage, and knelt beside the music stand where Amelia had performed. "Observe," he said, lifting a slat of polished wood near the front edge of the platform. Beneath, affixed with startling precision, was a taut steel wire that ran diagonally beneath the boards, vanishing into the orchestra pit. Holmes's fingers traced its path until he found its anchor, a small mechanism rigged to snap at the correct pitch vibration. "Crude," he said, "but clever. The sustained frequency of the high E string would have triggered a tension release, and then the stage would have fractured along this fault line, a 10-foot plunge into the pit below, enough to break a neck, or a legacy." With the grace of a surgeon, Holmes severed the wire using a small blade. The tension released with a faint twang, like the final sigh of a sinister overture. "I had a suspicion," he added, "that our masked patron was not content with a single contingency." I exhaled slowly. "Holmes, had Amelia played the original violin, she would not have survived the crescendo," he said, and turned toward the wings. "Now, let us deal with the conductor behind the curtain." Later that evening, as we sat once more in our Baker Street sitting room, the fire low, the air thick with tobacco and satisfaction, I turned to Holmes with a mixture of admiration and unease. "You let them play out their schemes," I said slowly. "You allowed Amelia to step onto that stage, knowing full well that danger waited on either side." Holmes, lounging in his dressing gown with his violin nestled beside him like a coiled companion, offered a languid nod. Yes, Watson, but only by letting the melody run its course could I expose the dissonance. Had I intervened too soon, we would have caught neither the conductor nor the composer of this little tragedy. But what if Amelia had refused your warning? She did not. She is her father's daughter, proud, but not foolish. I stared into the fire. It was a dangerous game, Holmes. Life, my dear Watson, is a dangerous game, but it is the timing that distinguishes the artist from the amateur. He drew the bow gently across the open G-string, producing a hum as low and melancholy as his own expression. Then, without turning, he added, I needed Retty to believe he still possessed the power to act. I needed our veiled benefactress to believe she had calculated every variable. What neither anticipated was each other. 2 crimes, 1 stage, I murmured. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. I conducted nothing, Watson. I merely arranged the overture and let the symphony fall apart in their hands. Outside, the night was quiet, but in the silence between the notes, I heard Holmes's final lesson, that the truest music of justice is often played unheard. We had scarcely removed our overcoats when Holmes, with his customary economy of movement, sank into his chair by the fireplace and reached for his pipe. The events of the evening, so swift and yet so intricately woven, had left my thoughts scattered and eager for explanation. For my part, I dropped into my familiar armchair opposite him, nursing a small brandy, and eyeing Holmes with the half-expectant, half-weary look of a man who knew he had once again missed the invisible thread that had guided his friend through the maze. Holmes struck a match, regarded it thoughtfully for a moment as it flared, then said, It is always astonishing, Watson, how melodrama can be constructed with the simplest instruments. A girl with a bow, a villain with a score, and a stage set not for music, but for memory. I gave a small groan. Holmes, I confess I am utterly at sea. You knew who was behind the mask all along, didn't you? From the moment he entered our chambers, Holmes replied coolly. The rest, my dear fellow, was merely orchestration. And with that tantalizing phrase, he exhaled a long plume of smoke and began. You remember, Watson, Holmes began, our client, or rather, our masquerading conductor, claimed to represent Amelia's interests and insisted on anonymity due to continental sensitivities. His voice was soft, but trembled on certain consonants. A trained ear, which happily I possess, would recognize a Hungarian accent masked beneath the veil of Oxford affectation. But who was he? I pressed. Not Retty. Certainly not. The true instigator was Count Miklos Sandor, once a minor nobleman and tutor to the House of Veres, until he vanished following the duel that ended Count Veres's life. I blinked. The duel that supposedly concerned Amelia's parentage. Just so. The whispers at the time were that the child, Amelia, was not only illegitimate, but the fruit of Sandor's own liaison with the Countess. Retty was blamed, the scandal erupted, and Sandor disappeared, not, I suspect, into exile, but into planning. He returned as a patron, I murmured. Returned as her savior, Holmes corrected me, to ensure she played and perished on his terms, thus ridding himself of the last living testament to his disgrace and reshaping the tale to favor his honor. The logic chilled me. He wished to martyr her and destroy Retty in the process. An elegant solution, Holmes said with disdain, except that it required more art than character, and more silence than truth. Your nose, Watson, though serviceable in medical matters, remains regrettably blunt in domestic observation, Holmes began, rising to fetch a slim folio from his bureau. You did not notice the peculiar tang clinging to our client's gloves? I confess I did not. It was amber-black Cavendish, a rare Hungarian blend, favoured by the Sandor household. You will not find it in London tobacconists, but I happen to recall it from a monograph I once penned on Eastern European pipe mixtures. He placed the folio in my lap. Inside were 2 pages of handwritten musical score, Now observe these. I looked closely. This is the piece Amelia played, or nearly did. Indeed. Except this particular version, a forgery, or notations added by someone unfamiliar with the true structure, subtle timing errors, exaggerated dynamics, designed not to aid the player, but to push her toward failure. And the rosin? I asked. Holmes gestured toward the violin case we had retrieved. On the second instrument, the one intended to fail, I detected a French rosin known for its brittleness under heat, not Amelia's usual choice. So both the music and the instrument were tampered with. Holmes nodded. 2 saboteurs, one beneath the stage with wire and rosin, the other above with scores and smoke, and both, by trusting in concealment, exposed themselves to the very precision they underestimated. I remained silent for some moments, the weight of Holmes's revelations settling like frost upon the air. At last I said, "You used her." Holmes did not flinch. "I employed her trust, yes, but I safeguarded her life. She believed she was merely playing for truth, not to be bait for murderers. She was playing for survival," Holmes said softly, "whether she knew it or not." I set down the folio with more force than I intended. "You could have warned her of the full danger. And risk panic or hesitation on stage? No, Watson. The violin requires certainty. Anything less would have ruined everything, including her." I stood and paced. "You may be right in method, but there is a line, Holmes, between calculation and cruelty." Holmes regarded me with that pale, appraising gaze I had come to both respect and resent. "There is also a line between justice and sentimentality." We stood there, silent for a moment, 2 men divided by purpose and united by outcome. Finally, he added, "She survived, Watson. Retty did not kill. Sandor did not flee. The web collapsed because she stood precisely where she had to." I sighed. "And does she know?" Holmes shook his head. "Not entirely, but I suspect she senses more than she admits. She is a violinist, after all, trained to hear what others ignore." And with that, he drew the bow across a string. The note was soft, but in it, I heard more than music. I heard burden, brilliance, and a truth neither of us dared voice aloud. Holmes settled back into his chair with that familiar air of a maestro about to conduct a symphony of revelations. "The tragedy, Watson, is not merely that 2 men plotted to silence a young virtuoso, but that they did so blinded by their own passions, pride, envy, and desperation." He gestured toward the violin case resting beside him. Retty, though presumed dead, was fueled by a thirst for vengeance that dulled his reason. He believed himself the aggrieved party. A fallen master denied his due. His bitterness transformed him into a ghost haunting the shadows of his own making. And Sandor? Holmes's eyes darkened. Sandor was the desperate strategist, clinging to a legacy slipping through his fingers. To him, Amelia was both salvation and curse, the embodiment of his sins and hopes. His plan to eliminate both Retty and his pupil was not merely cold calculation, but a fatal attempt to rewrite history. "They never saw each other coming," I observed. "Precisely. Like discordant notes in a tragic composition, their schemes clashed and shattered each other's ambitions. Each thought himself the conductor of fate, only to become an instrument of ruin." Holmes folded his hands neatly. "The key, Watson, was to understand their illusions, their belief in control." "You mean you let them believe they were masters of the game?" "Indeed. Retty was given the impression that his every move was unseen, yet he was shadowed. Sandor believed his masked presence would remain inscrutable, but I had placed observers in every corner." He opened a ledger, pointing to a series of correspondences and intercepted messages. "I allowed false intelligence to reach their ears, a whispered hint here, a staged threat there, enough to provoke rash actions without revealing our hand. You were the true puppeteer. Holmes smiled thinly. A conductor, if you will. I orchestrated their moves so that they stepped upon each other's strings. A duel without blades, played out in silence and shadows. And Amelia, she was the silent audience, unaware of the score's dark undertones. Her trust was the melody that carried the discord. I frowned. That strikes me as a perilous gamble. Holmes shrugged. Life and art both require risks. The difference lies in how one conducts the performance. I could no longer contain my unease. Holmes, forgive me, but you used Amelia like a pawn, a mere piece moved across a deadly board. Did it not trouble you, placing her in such peril, even for the sake of justice? Holmes regarded me with a glance both piercing and devoid of sentiment. Watson, to be a pawn is often to be the most vital piece on the board. Amelia's role was neither cruel nor careless, but necessary. Necessary, I repeated incredulously. You risked her life as bait. No, he said quietly. I risked the failure of my plan if she hesitated. The girl needed certainty, not fear. To betray that would have doomed us all. I paced, the warmth of frustration rising in my chest. And yet, she remains unaware. She trusts you blindly, even as you orchestrated this danger. Holmes exhaled, a rare sigh. I do not ask for her trust. I demand her courage, and she has shown it in abundance. I softened. And if this were not a game of shadows, but of human lives, Holmes? Where does your conscience find refuge? His eyes flickered with something almost like sorrow. In the knowledge that without such measures, there would be no music left to play, only silence. The following morning, as dawn crept through the windows of 221B Baker Street, Holmes presented me with a small parcel wrapped in soft cloth. Unfolding it, I revealed Amelia's broken bow, the one that had snapped under such dire circumstances. Yet, to my astonishment, it was mended. Fine silver wire, delicately wound around the fractured wood, binding it together with both strength and artistry. Holmes watched my expression with an inscrutable smile. Even broken things may yet play true, Watson. A bow is much like a man, fractured, but capable of renewal. I looked up. Will she understand the gesture? Perhaps not immediately, Holmes said, but the weight of such care often speaks louder than words. It is a token, not merely of repair, but of hope. He paused, fingers trailing the length of the bow as if recalling its every note. Music is forgiveness given form. Justice, when tempered with mercy, is the same. I thought of Amelia, of the courage she had shown, and the peril she had faced. You have a rare kindness beneath that austere exterior, Holmes. He inclined his head. Kindness tempered by necessity, my dear Watson, and sometimes that is all one can offer in a world so often deaf to mercy. We sat in silence, the bough resting between us like a fragile covenant. And as the morning light filled the room, I felt that for once, the music had ended on a note of peace. It was late one misty evening when I returned to find Holmes seated in his favorite chair, the room cast in flickering shadows from the dying fire. His violin lay cradled beneath his chin, and from its strings poured the haunting melody I'd first heard upon our arrival. Yet something was different. The tune was softer, less burdened by sorrow, as if the very man playing it had shifted in subtle ways. I sat quietly, listening to the sorrowful notes ripple through the stillness. Holmes's eyes were closed, his expression unreadable. It struck me then how this simple, melancholic piece had become a mirror, reflecting not only the story we had lived through, but the quiet evolution of the man who solved it. The song, once sharp with tension, now felt tempered by a fragile peace. As the final note lingered in the air, Holmes lowered his violin slowly, a faint shadow crossing his features. I wondered what thoughts lay behind those closed eyes, silent as the night itself. I ventured softly, Holmes, I now realize the tune you play is that Hungarian lament, the one we discussed on our first evening. Yet, tonight, I hear it differently. That discordant, biting note you once struck so deliberately is gone. He opened his eyes and regarded me with his usual cool precision. Ah, Watson, the note was a dissonance, a truth too harsh for the ear to bear unsoftened. Removing it does not erase the pain, merely masks it beneath a veil of harmony. But it made the music memorable. It gave it character. Holmes nodded. True, yet life often demands the silencing of sharpness for survival. The discord became a danger, a reminder better kept in the shadows. I sat back, pondering. To silence a painful truth was a luxury not afforded to many, least of all the detective who pursued it relentlessly. I hesitated before asking the question I had long pondered. Holmes, after all this, the betrayals, the near deaths, the fragile trust, placed and shattered, do you ever feel the weight of it all? The toll it takes on the soul? He regarded me with a faint, ironic smile. Watson, I am a man of logic and deduction, not sentiment. Emotion is a luxury that clouds judgment. The toll you speak of is not mine to bear. It belongs to those who lack clarity. But surely you are not untouched by it. Perhaps, he said quietly, but I choose to dwell in the realm of reason, where suffering is an equation to solve, not a wound to nurse. His gaze drifted toward the window, the night swallowing his words. I knew better than to press further. Some truths, like notes in a minor key, were meant to remain unspoken. Setting his violin aside with deliberate care, Holmes remarked dryly, Watson, a puzzle that bleeds is no puzzle at all. It is tragedy. I deal in enigmas that surrender their secrets without lamentation. I smiled faintly at his customary detachment. Yet even enigmas leave a mark, Holmes. Perhaps, but the mark is on the solver, not the puzzle. With that, he resumed his contemplative silence, the room thick with unspoken complexities. The room was quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, its steady rhythm filling the space between us. Just as I allowed my thoughts to wander from the shadows of our recent case, there came a sharp knock upon the door, followed by the entrance of a breathless messenger. He handed Holmes a telegram, its contents hastily scrawled but unmistakably urgent. Holmes's eyes scanned the note with that familiar spark of interest. A curious affair, Watson, he said. A stolen emerald, a ghost that appears only at dawn, and a client who fears the past is not done with him. I could only grin, the promise of another mystery lighting my own spirits. Holmes's violin lay quiet now, but his mind was already composing a new symphony, one of secrets yet to be unveiled. And so, with the clock marking the passing moments, our story turned once more to the unknown. As the embers in the hearth dwindled to a faint glow, Holmes leaned back with that familiar, inscrutable calm. Watson, it is curious how the sharpest melodies often conceal the deepest silences, and how the most intricate plots unravel not through force, but through trust and betrayal intertwined. In this case, pride and revenge were the true adversaries, far more dangerous than any weapon. He paused, eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. What, do you suppose, was the criminal's gravest error?